All right, welcome to the deep dive. Today, we're going to get into something that I think a lot of people have probably felt themselves, right? That connection between wanting to do well and actually doing well, especially with studying and learning.
It feels right, doesn't it?
It does. It feels like the more motivated you are, the better you'll do.
Yeah.
But here's the thing. What's really interesting is how the better you do, that actually can boost your motivation. It kind of goes both ways.
Exactly. And the source material that we're going to be looking at for this deep dive is a pretty comprehensive review. It's called Motivation Achievement Cycles in Learning, a literature review and research agenda. That's a mouthful, but basically it's a really thorough look at decades of research on this two-way relationship.
Yeah. So we're not just going to be talking about the fact that, yeah, when people want to do well, they generally do better. That seems pretty obvious. But what we're going to do in this deep dive is really dig into what research actually tells us about how this works, where there's agreement, where there are gaps, and importantly, where are some of the debates and arguments? How do we really spark both that drive and the good results?
Well, and the foundation of all of this is really a ton of different theories about academic motivation.
Oh, yeah.
So we're going to touch on those a little bit because those theories kind of give us a framework for understanding how this all might actually work.
Okay, so before we get into all the specific research and findings and things, I think it's helpful to kind of set the stage a little bit with these different theories about what motivation is, how it works, what are some of the core themes that we see across all these different ideas, even when they might disagree on certain things.
Right. Well, a really big theme is this idea of what they call appraisal. And that basically means that when we're faced with some task, like a challenging problem or studying for a test, there's kind of this unconscious process where we're asking ourselves two big questions. One is, how much do I value this? How important is it to me? How worthwhile is it? And the other is, what's my expectation for succeeding? Do I think I can actually do this? So that combination of value and expectancy is like a really fundamental building block in a lot of these motivation theories.
So it's not just how badly you want to do well, it's also how much you believe you can actually do well. Like, is that little voice in your head saying, yeah, I can totally rock this, or is it saying, ugh, this is hopeless?
Exactly, exactly. And you see that reflected in some of these kind of key theories that have been around for a while. So, for example, expectancy value theory puts expectancy and value right at the center, as you might guess from the name. But also attribution theory, which looks at how we explain our successes and failures, like, do we think we succeeded because we're smart or because we got lucky? That also ties into this idea. And then you have things like control value theory and even Dweck's integrative theory, which brings in growth mindset. They all kind of highlight in different ways how those beliefs about value and our expectations shape our motivation.
Now, I know we also have some theories that maybe lean more heavily on one side of that equation, right? Some that are really focused on the value part.
Right. Yeah, so goal theories, for example, look at what we're aiming for. Like, are we trying to really master the material or just get a good grade? And flow theory explores that feeling of being totally absorbed in an activity, which is all about the inherent value of the experience itself, right? It feels good to be in flow. And then you have self-determination theory, which really emphasizes our need for autonomy, that sense of control, competence, and relatedness as drivers of what we call intrinsic motivation, wanting to do things for their own sake. And then, of course, you have interest theories, which, as the name suggests, focus on how much we actually enjoy something or find it fascinating.
Okay, so those are all kind of like the why bother theories.
Yeah.
What about the can I even do this side of things? That are some of the theories there.
Well, that's where things like self-efficacy theory come in. That's all about believing in your ability to do specific things, like to solve a certain type of math problem or to write a good essay. And then various control theories really look at our sense of agency, how much we feel we're in control of our own learning process.
Okay.
And social cognitive self-regulation theories explore how we actually manage our own learning, like setting goals for ourselves, monitoring our progress, and maybe changing our strategies if something's not working.
Now, one term that kept popping up in the research is academic self-concept, or ASE. It seems like researchers love this concept. So what is it, and why is it such a big deal in this area of study?
Yeah, you're right. It's everywhere. And it's basically how you see yourself as a student, like your beliefs about your overall academic abilities.
Hmm.
But it's not just like this general feeling of, am I good at school or not? It's usually seen as multidimensional, meaning there are different facets to it. So you might feel really confident in your math skills, but not so much in like writing or history.
Well, yeah, like knowing you can ace a science test, but feeling totally lost in English class. I think we've all been there.
Yeah. And because it's kind of specific and measurable, you can actually give people questionnaires to see what their ASC is. It's become a very popular concept for researchers looking at this link between motivation and achievement.
Okay.
And the basic idea is that these self-beliefs, including your ASC, really drive how you approach learning. They affect how much effort you put in, whether you stick with things when they get hard, what kind of goals you set for yourself.
So it's like if you believe you're good at something, you're more likely to put in the effort, which then, of course, makes you better at it.
Exactly, that feedback loop.
Yeah, it's all connected.
And self-worth theory suggests that those positive self-beliefs actually make us value academic stuff more. Like, we're more likely to see the point in doing the work, maybe find it more interesting, recognize it's actually useful. And self-determination theory chimes in here too, emphasizing that feeling competent is a basic human need. We need to feel like we can do things. And that drives intrinsic motivation. It makes us value the tasks for their own sake. And it's interesting, one study found that this need for competence was the strongest predictor of how much college students felt they were actually learning.
Wow, so feeling capable is really powerful for you as a learner.
Really important.
Now, our outline also talks about how this appraisal, that weighing of value and expectancy we were talking about, leads to something called engagement. How does that fit into this whole web of motivation and achievement?
Right. Well, engagement is basically like being actively involved in the learning. You're not just passively sitting there. And the self-regulatory view of motivation emphasizes this link. It says that after you've kind of assessed how much you value something and how likely you are to succeed, you then start to manage your own learning in this active way.
Okay.
So that involves things like planning your study time, focusing your attention while you're working, using effective strategies, being strategic. And a key part of this self-regulation is metacognition. That's your ability to kind of think about your own thinking, to be aware of how you learn best and monitor your progress.
So it's not enough to just want to learn. You have to also be smart about how you learn.
Right, right. Be aware of what's working for you. And this whole appraisal process also plays a big role in how we feel when we're learning. Control value theory, for example, highlights that your beliefs about your control and the value of the task can trigger emotions like pride when you succeed, hope, but also potentially boredom if you're not that into it, or even enjoyment, right? You
Okay,
can
wow.
actually enjoy the learning itself. And these emotions then influence what they call achievement behaviors, which are basically the things you do to reach your goals.
It sounds like motivation and emotions are really closely linked. It must be tricky for researchers to separate those sometimes.
Yeah, yeah. The line can be pretty blurry. Emotions tend to be more fleeting, they come and go. But they can definitely impact your motivation by changing how much you value something or how confident you feel. But it's not just a one-way street, right? It's not just motivation influencing emotions. Some research suggests that your emotions can actually impact your achievement over time, and vice versa. So, yeah, a very complex relationship.
It's all very intricate, this whole web of motivation, how we size things up, how engaged we are, our emotions, and then, of course, the actual achievement. But let's zoom in a little bit on the actual pathways that connect motivation and achievement.
Mm.
Our outline kind of breaks this down into how does motivation lead to achievement, and then the reverse. How does achievement lead back to motivation? So let's start with that first direction. How does actually being motivated make you do better?
Right. Well, at a really basic level, it seems to come down to two main things. One is just the sheer quantity of academic behaviors. Things like how much effort you put into studying, how persistent you are when you hit a snag. The research literature is kind of full of examples of this. Like,
Yeah.
students who are more motivated tend to spend more time studying. They're more likely to complete their assignments, that kind of thing.
Okay, so basically, the more motivated you are, the more time and energy you're going to invest in actually doing the work.
Yeah.
Okay, that seems fairly intuitive.
It does, but the second pathway is maybe a little more nuanced, and that's the quality of those behaviors. So higher motivation, it's not just about doing more, it's about doing it better. It can lead to you using more effective learning strategies, like really trying to understand the material rather than just rote memorizing it, or using those metacognitive skills we talked about to monitor your learning and adjust your approach. or techniques like spaced repetition, coming back to the material over time. And one interesting finding is that if you're genuinely interested in something or you have that intrinsic motivation, you're more likely to go deeper with your learning, not just trying to get by, but to really understand. And having positive motivation, like that belief in your ability to grow and learn, what we call a growth mindset, that can encourage you to focus on mastery rather than just performance.
That makes a lot of sense. Like if you're really into something, you're going to dig deeper and you're going to figure out better ways to learn it. Okay, so that's how motivation can drive achievement. Now let's flip the script. How does actually achieving things loop back and influence our motivation?
Right. Well, this seems to happen through a couple of main routes. One is kind of what we were talking about earlier, this idea of perceived achievement. A lot of theories suggest that when you experience success, or at least when you feel like you've succeeded, it builds your confidence and your sense of control over your learning. And what's really key here is your own evaluation of how you've done.
It's how you see it.
Exactly, right. If you feel like you've done well, even if it wasn't a perfect score, it can boost your confidence and even make you value those learning activities more in the future.
So like a taste of success can make you want more.
Yeah, exactly. It kind of creates that positive cycle.
Like that feeling when you finally grasp a tough concept, you're like, okay, I want more of that.
Right. And the second pathway is really interesting, and it comes from flow theory. When you're completely absorbed and engaged in an activity, maybe you're working on a challenging problem that's right at your skill level. You get that feeling of flow, and that in itself can be incredibly rewarding, and it can increase the value you put on doing that type of activity in the future.
Mm.
So, think about those moments where you're so engrossed in something you lose track of time. That's flow, and it can make you actively seek out those kinds of experiences again.
It's almost like this motivation achievement cycle can kind of become self-fueling, right? Once you get it going.
Exactly.
But I think it's important to remember that this isn't happening in a vacuum. There are things outside of us, external factors that can play a really big role.
Oh, absolutely. It's not just this internal loop, things like external rewards, maybe getting a good grade or praise from a teacher, even just a promise of a treat or requirements set by the school or parents. Those can all kind of kickstart that cycle because they change how much we value the work. And, self-determination theory would say we don't want to rely too heavily on those external rewards because it can undermine intrinsic motivation.
Right.
But they can definitely be a spark. And it's really helpful if those environments are supportive, if they give you that sense of autonomy, feeling like you have some control over your learning and that sense of connection with others. Those things can all increase the value we place on education, and that then boosts motivation.
So sometimes maybe a little push from the outside is what you need to get the ball rolling.
Exactly. And it's not just about rewards or rules, right? Cultural norms, like what's seen as important or valuable in your society, social learning, what you pick up from the people around you, even just verbal encouragement or criticism. Those can all shape your expectations, your values, how you explain your successes and failures. So those external factors can really make a difference in keeping that cycle going in a positive direction, or unfortunately, sometimes in a negative one.
Now, what about things like deadlines or exams? Because it seems like those definitely drive achievement.
Oh, yeah.
Even if you're not feeling super motivated to study.
You're absolutely right. Yeah, external requirements can definitely lead to achievement, even if you're not feeling it at the start. Similarly, the quality of the teaching you're getting, how clear the instructions are, how good your study materials are, those can all have a big impact on your achievement. Sometimes, regardless of your initial motivation, like if you have a teacher who can explain things in a way that just clicks for you, you're way more likely to do well, right?
Absolutely. And our outline also points out that how we see our own achievements, that perception, can actually be influenced by those external factors.
Yeah.
Which then, of course, feeds right back into our motivation. So it's really important to understand how those things all connect.
Oh, it's crucial. Yeah. How you perceive your achievement isn't just about the grade on the test, right? It's shaped by things like how feedback is given. Does your teacher focus on how you rank compared to everyone else? Or do they highlight your individual progress and mastery?
Right.
That makes a big difference.
Huge.
Yeah. And feedback that focuses on effort rather than just the outcome can really change how you see your own abilities.
Yeah.
And then, of course, social comparison, that's how you stack up against your peers and how you explain your successes and failures. Did you do well because you studied hard or because the test was easy? Did you fail because you're not smart enough or because you just didn't prepare? All those explanations we come up with, those attributions, can really influence how we perceive our achievement and therefore how it affects our motivation. So yeah, even if you achieve at a high level, if you're constantly comparing yourself to others who are doing even better, that might not give you the motivational boost that you deserve.
So all these external factors are super important to understand if we want to make sure that motivation and achievement cycle is spinning in a good direction for ourselves and for others. Now, we've been talking a lot about the theory behind all this, but what does the actual research tell us? What's the evidence that this back and forth relationship is real?
Right. Well, the early support really came from those studies that just looked at a single point in time, what they call cross-sectional studies. And they showed a link between particularly academic self-concept and achievement. But those kinds of studies can't really tell us what came first, the chicken or the egg,
Right.
Like, did the motivation lead to the achievement or the other way around?
Yeah.
So the next wave of research used what we call longitudinal studies. They follow the same students over time, and they use fancy statistical techniques to see how things change. And those started to show that, yeah, motivation and achievement, they do seem to influence each other over time.
So these studies, like, tracked students as they went through school and looked at how changes in their motivation might be related to later changes in their grades.
Right, exactly. And more recent studies have gotten even more sophisticated. They use really big data sets collected over many years to track these things across a student's whole school career. And meta-analyses, which are basically studies of studies, they combine the results of lots of individual studies. They've generally supported this reciprocal relationship. And what's really interesting is that some recent meta-analyses suggest that the impact of achievement on motivation might actually be stronger than the impact of motivation on achievement in some cases.
Oh, interesting. So it's not always a clear-cut motivation leads to achievement. Sometimes it's more about the achievement boosting that motivation.
Exactly. Yeah. It's not always a straightforward path.
Now, what about those studies where researchers actually try to change something? Maybe they try to boost someone's motivation, or maybe they try change their level of achievement. What have those experiments told us about this cycle?
Right. Well, interventions that try to boost motivation, maybe working with students on their self-concept or helping them set better goals, they generally show positive effects on achievement. But what's kind of surprising is that the specific theory behind the intervention doesn't seem to matter that much.
Oh, that's interesting.
Yeah, like different ways of boosting motivation, they often work similarly well.
Interesting.
And studies that try to manipulate achievement directly and then see how it affects motivation, those are less common because, frankly, it's a lot harder to do ethically and practically, right? You can't just make someone fail at something and see what happens to their motivation.
Right.
But there are some examples, like some studies have set up students to succeed on a task and then give them positive feedback. And that often leads to an increase in self-efficacy for similar tasks. But the real gold standard, the kind of study that really nails down cause and effect, would be to manipulate one variable, like motivation, and then see how it affects achievement later on. And then see how that change in achievement loops back and affects motivation. That kind of study is still pretty rare in this field.
It sounds like we have a good sense that this two-way street exists, but there's still a lot to learn about how it actually works. And that brings us to the research agenda outlined in our source material. What are some of the big unanswered questions? What do researchers still need to figure out?
Right. There's so much more to explore. One big area is just looking at more kinds of motivation. It's not all about academic self-concept. While ASC is valuable, it can get a little blurry with achievement itself. Like some of the questions used to measure it can kind of overlap with how students are reporting their performance. And we're seeing that different aspects of motivation change at different rates as students go through school, suggesting that they might have unique relationships with achievement.
Right. Like how you feel about your overall ability as a student might be different from how interested you are in, I don't know, ancient history or something.
Right, exactly.
And those things might influence your learning in different ways.
Absolutely. And by focusing so much on ASC, we might be missing other really important things that we could change, like boosting interest in a specific subject or increasing that sense of control over learning, which might actually be easier to influence. And there's also this concern that we've been too focused on these individual internal views of motivation.
Okay.
And we haven't paid enough attention to the social stuff, the environment,
Yeah.
And plus, ASC is often measured through self-report questionnaires, which have limitations. Like, how accurate are those? There are people biased in how they answer. So the call is really for more research that includes other motivation stuff,
So
achievement goals, self-efficacy for specific tasks, genuine interest, intrinsic motivation. Why do you want to learn this for its own sake? And while some studies are starting to do this, ASC still kind of dominates the field.
Okay, so looking at a wider variety of motivational factors, not just this one. And another really important point that was raised is behaviors are supposed to be that link between motivation and achievement.
Yeah.
Like motivation leads to putting in effort, using good strategies, which then leads to better results. But do we actually have good evidence that those behaviors are really the missing link?
Right. Yeah, that's a really good question. Because while the theory says, yeah, these behaviors are the bridge, there's a surprising lack of studies that actually measure these behaviors in detail over time.
Yeah.
Like, what are students actually doing when they're learning? The initial studies that have looked at effort, they've had mixed results. And part of the problem is that effort itself is really hard to define and measure. Is it how hard you feel like you're trying? Or is it how much time you spend on something? And then how effort relates to achievement can be complicated too. Sometimes if you feel like you have to put in a ton of effort just to keep up, that can be demotivating. Because it might make you think, well, maybe I'm just not good at this.
That makes sense.
So yeah, we need more research that really track those behaviors, both the quantity and the quality. Are students using things like active recall? Are they actually testing themselves on the material? Are they seeking help when they're stuck? We need to know that stuff.
Yeah. And the research agenda also talks about taking a mutualistic perspective and using what they call a network approach. Can you explain what that's all about?
Yeah, so this perspective recognizes that motivation isn't just one thing, right? It's a whole system of different factors that all interact. So instead of just looking at one or two things in isolation, like just self-concept or just interest, the network approach uses these statistical techniques to map out how lots of different motivation things relate to each other and to behaviors and to achievement. And the idea is that these connections are real. Like, they're not because those things have a common cause, they actually influence each other directly.
So it's like a more holistic view of motivation.
Right. And one study that used this approach, they looked at science interest in different countries.
Yeah.
And they found that different motivation things played a more central role depending on the culture. So what this suggests is if you're trying to boost science interest, the best way to do it might need to be tailored to that specific cultural setting. And this network perspective, it's really powerful because it can help us figure out, okay, what are the most effective things to target if we want to make a difference? And it can help us model how those things actually play out in the real world, all those interactions.
Now, another really interesting point that was raised is the time scale of these interactions. Because most of the research looks at changes over pretty long periods, like months or even years. But we know that motivation can change much more quickly than that.
Right, absolutely. Day to day, hour to hour, yeah.
Exactly. So are we missing something by only looking at the big picture?
It's possible because a lot of the theories don't really specify a time frame. And some newer views emphasize how motivation can change from one moment to the next as we're learning. So it's very likely that there are both these short, fast cycle happening as well as the longer, slower ones. And different aspects of motivation might change at different speeds. So, your academic self-concept, how you see yourself as a student, that might be fairly stable over time.
Okay.
But your interest in a specific task, that might spike and then fade away pretty quickly.
Yeah.
So we need research that captures those dynamics, especially at those shorter task-level timescales.
Right. Like if we only look at the big picture, we might miss some really important details about how to support learning in those individual moments.
Exactly. So using more diverse time intervals, collecting data more frequently, those intensive longitudinal designs, those can give us a much richer picture, and they can help us figure out, okay, what are the things that change quickly that we can maybe target for those more immediate interventions?
Now, this brings us to a really fundamental question in research, and that's causality. How do we know that a change in motivation is actually causing a change in achievement. And it's not just the other way around, or maybe something else entirely is influencing both.
Yeah, that's the million-dollar question, isn't it?
Right.
Because most of the research relies on that longitudinal data and statistical modeling, which shows us relationships, but it doesn't prove cause and effect. And to really nail down causality, you need those experimental manipulations where researchers actually change one thing and then see what happens to the other. And to prove a reciprocal effect, you would need to show that changing motivation affects achievement later, and that changing achievement, or maybe more realistically, how you perceive your achievement, that affects your motivation.
Yeah, those studies are hard to do.
They're really difficult
Yeah.
because, manipulating achievement in the real world, it's tricky. You don't want to be messing with people's grades just for the sake of research.
Right, right.
So there are definitely ethical concerns and practical ones too. Yeah.
So, yeah, more research that can really meet those criteria for establishing those causal reciprocal links, that would be
Oh.
huge.
Now, the agenda also mentions something that sounds kind of technical, but apparently it's really important, and that's choosing the right statistical models when you're analyzing that longitudinal data. Apparently, the actual statistical techniques you use can influence whether you even find a reciprocal relationship.
Right, yeah, and that might not be obvious if you're not a researcher,
Yeah.
but the choice of statistical model can really matter.
Yeah.
Some studies that haven't found strong evidence for these reciprocal relationships, or that have questioned how robust they are, they've really highlighted the importance of the model you choose.
Okay.
Like, one study found support for the reciprocal link using one type of model, but not another type that's designed to account for those individual changes over time. And it all comes back to being really careful about other things that might be influencing both motivation and achievement at the same time,
Mm-hmm.
what we call those confounding variables.
So yeah, making sure we're using the right tools to analyze the data. That's crucial.
Now, we've talked a lot about how researchers use those self-report questionnaires to measure motivation. But are there other ways, maybe more objective ways, to get at what's really motivating us?
Yeah, definitely. People are realizing that self-report has limitations, right? It's subjective, it relies on us being aware of our own motivations, and there can be all sorts of biases.
Yeah.
So the research agenda really encourages using other methods, things like experience sampling, where you ask people about their experiences multiple times a day, daily diaries, think aloud protocols where people say what they're thinking out loud while they're working, even just observing students in classrooms. We're also seeing some cool advancements in online measures that can be collected while people are learning, like tracking the choices learners make in digital environments, or using video recordings to analyze engagement. And technology-based data collection, like looking at patterns of how people practice voluntarily on online learning platforms, that's giving us new ways to measure motivation, too. And even more cutting edge are what they call process-oriented measures. Things like eye tracking, facial expressions, even physiological responses.
Physiological, like are we talking heart rate and stuff?
Yeah, exactly. Stuff like heart rate variability, electrodermal activity, which measures changes in your skin conductance, even brain activity using EEG. Those can give us these really high-frequency moment-to-moment measures of things like arousal, how much effort you're putting in, even your overall motivational state. Like, are you approaching the task or are you kind of avoiding it? And while none of these are ready to replace those good old-fashioned questionnaires completely, the future of motivation research probably lies in what they call triangulation.
Triangulation.
Yeah, basically combining multiple methods, both the self-report stuff and these more objective measures, to get a much richer, more complete picture of what's going on.
So we're not throwing out the old ways, but we're adding new tools to the toolbox.
Right.
Okay. Now, what about measuring achievement itself? Because it seems pretty straightforward, but are there any kind of hidden complexities there?
Yeah, even something that seems as simple as achievement can be tricky to measure well. Like, achievement is usually specific to a certain subject. So what we find in math might not be true for reading or history.
Right.
And the type of measurement we use, standardized tests, grades, even just a teacher's assessment, those can all influence the results, because they might not be equally reliable, or they might be measuring different aspects of learning. And in longitudinal studies, it can be hard to make sure you're measuring the same skill over time, because as students learn, those skills are changing too.
Right.
And finally, there can be a disconnect between how researchers often think about achievement, like mastering a specific skill, and how achievement is often communicated to students, which is usually in comparison to their peers, right? Like you got the 90th percentile.
Right.
And that difference can really impact how students see their own achievement, which of course then affects their motivation.
It's all connected.
It really is, yeah.
Now, finally, the research agenda really stresses the importance of thinking about how far we can generalize these findings. So does this whole motivation achievement cycle play out the same way for everyone, regardless of like age or cultural background?
That's a really important question. And the answer is probably not. We know that motivation and achievement, they follow different developmental paths as we go from childhood to adulthood. Like motivation can become more diverse. It might even decline in some areas during adolescence.
Okay.
And those changes in how sensitive we are to rewards, how good we are at controlling our impulses, our basic beliefs about motivation, those suggest that the relationship between motivation and achievement might evolve as we age too. And then the social influences from family, friends, school, those change a lot as we develop too.
Right.
So we definitely need more studies that look at this across a wider age range, not just focusing on one age group. And then there's the issue of cultural differences. A lot of the research in psychology has been done in what they call weird societies, Western, educated, industrialized, rich, and democratic. Right.
Weird. I love that acronym.
Yeah, it's catchy. But it's a problem because motivation can be influenced by very different things depending on your culture. Even the meaning of basic concepts like self-concept or achievement goals, those can vary across cultures. So assuming that what we find in these weird samples is universal, that's premature, right? We need more diverse samples in research. We need to do a better job of representing different groups within the regions that have been studied.